very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to today's edition of the Situation Corner. My name is Roger Suriago, and with me is Howard Musigwa, a man of very many titles. I will certainly not mention all of them and finish them, but I'm going to give him the honor to be able to introduce himself. But before he does that, just to remind you that you can find this conversation on the YouTube channel of the Faraja Television. We are here every Tuesday evening at 5 p.m. to be exact, so make it a point to find us there, contribute to the conversation, put there your comment. Another time we could build another conversation on that comment that you have. If you have a question, I'm glad to invite Howard another time to also sort of expound on some of those issues. So thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Mr. Howard, you're welcome to the Situation Corner.
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure.
How are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm so humbled to be here again. I was here perhaps 3 or so years ago, so it's really, really humbling to be back.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. So if you could just introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what do you do? You could mention some of those titles. I'm trying to avoid to mispronounce some of them, so that can be treasonous.
Rogers, you flatter me. Yeah? So my name is Howard Musigwa, as introduced, and principally I have the humbling privilege of being the chairperson of the EU in Uganda Youth Sounding Board, but professionally I'm a lawyer, and vocationally I'm an energy and environment or climate justice advocate. And I thank God who has enabled me to find purpose in that direction, and I'm hoping to contribute to the conversation today in that regard.
All right. Thank you so much for coming, first of all, but also for the work that you do, one with the board, another with the energy transition. We've seen you doing some work, even in the media, with, was it Al Jazeera, during the Africa Climate Week in Nairobi. That was very, by the way, interesting. We were honored and glad as a country, because then you're representing the country, you're representing
certainly.
the youths of Uganda, and we don't take any of that lightly. So to begin with, you are the chairperson of the European Union Youth Sounding Board in Uganda. For a youth who is out there, they would like to understand, first of all, what is the EU Youth Sounding Board? How does it work? First, to begin with, what is it? What about the EU Youth Sounding Board?
So the EU Youth Sounding Board is an initiative of the EU in Uganda, but also I think I should begin from the international level, because all the way from the headquarters in Brussels, the idea was to include young people and give them a central role in shaping the EU development cooperation across the globe. And so you find that in the multi-annual indicative program of the European Union, from 2021 to 2027, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and of course, like it's a global initiative, but the one that we fall under is one on sub-Saharan Africa. One of the target demographic groups is actually young people, the youth. And for Uganda, it's even more interesting because young people contribute, and we've talked about this over there, as contribute about 78% of the population. So that means if you can reach out to them, you're reaching out to 78% of the population. And so that is why the EU felt it important to give young people a central role in shaping the development cooperation in Uganda. So last year, I think in August, should have been in August, also towards the end of August, we had the inauguration of the board. About 20 young people that were chosen. It was an open call, and young people applied in Uganda, and the coordination was done by Faraja Africa Foundation, and of course in conjunction with the EU. And then the 20 were selected, and then we had an onboarding where we were able to choose select internal leadership, and we have the chairperson, the vice chairperson, and the general secretary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I was hoping to skip that bit. Yeah, so and we have thematic leads as well. It's an amazing structure. Just know that we're in the first year, and so it's a 2-year term, and the hope is that in this first year we'll put in place the structures we need. And then as we roll out, towards the second year, we'll be able to again do some stock taking and sort of consolidate, the work that we've been doing so far. So yeah, in a nutshell, really, the work of the body is to advise the European Union on youth engagement, but also to sort of do the amplification of the voices of young people in shaping the EU-Uganda development cooperation.
So in this work that the board does, particularly because you mentioned that they help in shaping the development cooperation and the work of the EU in Uganda make it a little more realistic in this the local sense. There has been this common sentiment, and not just about the EU, even the local leadership in the country here, as much as it is outside and in other countries. There's a sentiment that youth will come and say many of these things, but largely they go one unimplemented. Even when you provide a position as young people, as a body, sometimes it can be overlooked. So as a board, how do you see that? How do you try to work around that issue? Is the EU more open than what we traditionally know in many of these spaces, including our country?
So I think the confidence we can have, Rogers, is that this initiative was really founded from the EU side, and not just the EU in Uganda, but from the headquarters in Brussels. And so it is a deliberate effort. It's actually a youth action plan. That is really an initiative of the EU to see how it can empower young people across the globe to be more meaningfully involved in shaping the development of their countries. So from our experience so far, I think we've had some pretty meaningful engagement with the EU hitherto. And so we trust that we are not there, formality or, as a ceremonial board, but to, in our engagements, in the initiatives that we have as well individually, to see how we can shape development cooperation. So from what we have done so far, or from my interaction with the EU so far, we can be confident, but also the reception has been warm and meaningful. I mean, we have periodic interaction with officials from the EU, and the ambassador himself has been very welcoming from the time we had our inauguration last year. And so I can confidently say that the EU has been receptive, but also in the meaningful. I mean, about 2 or so weeks ago, we just had our meeting really to just roll out what there should look like, and we have a number of those periodic meetings as well. But also on our end, it is an opportunity we have. So as much as we might ask ourselves what the EU is doing, we have a mandate as the board. So we must look within as well. What are we doing with this platform, with the access that we have to to the EU? And it's not. And when you hear EU, you might think it's just a delegation. We have the delegation, not a delegation, yes, but we have access to the different embassies as well that fall within the EU and the development agencies as well. So and it's a big mandate on our end. And so the question will be at the end of the day, as the youth sounding board, how are we leveraging our positions, on this space, to reflect and amplify the voices of young people as well, but also to ensure that there is meaningful engagement. We can't sit that and sort of relegate ourselves to just seeing what the EU does. We've been given the latitude, the platform, and now we need to look within. How are we leveraging, that space, that platform, to ensure there's meaningful interaction and engagement, but also there's impact, to the young person out there in Uganda, because that is our principal mandate, to get the voice of that young person at the grassroots, to ensure their aspirations and hopes are integrated in the development cooperation between Uganda and the European Union.
You did preempt my question. But so in this whole work, Uganda has a lot of youth structures. We have the National Youth Council, we have the Uganda National Student Association. We have, I don't want to get into politics, but those youth leagues in different spaces. How does now the board work with many of these youth organizations and youth structures that are already existing to see that the work is not just about the EU, like you mentioned, but it's more, it entrenches, it gets more deep to the down structures, the very low ones. How do you work with all of this?
So I think the first point I need to make, Rogers, is that many of those structures, and without prejudice to their mandate, have certain political affiliations in one way or the other. And that is the reality as we have it. So in our interaction with them, and I think one of the differences really fundamental is that the board is not a political organization, it's not a political affiliation, not a chapter. It is an initiative. It's actually a bridge, between the EU and the young people in Uganda. That capillary that we have is actually the EU sounding board. So the difference in ideology then is that we do not have, whereas we have a thematic lead, on governance, we look at it as a notion, governance as a notion, not as a political aspect. You see, so in our interaction with them, of course, we understand that many of them have ground structures. For example, UNSA, National Youth Council, and I think that the opportunity we have there as the board is to see how we can probably enter into memoranda of understanding, into agreements, how we can probably even venture into initiatives to see how we can utilize those structures that are already in place with UNSA or the National Youth Council, even other chapters in tertiary institutions or institutions of higher learning, or even like lower structures all the way to the grassroots, to see how we can work together to utilize those structures to be able to get the aspirations and hopes of young people through those structures, and even in engagement and consultations, and then sort of collect them and then take them for further engagement or inculcation in the policies of the EU. So I think that is an opportunity that we have to collaborate, because one of the challenges, many challenges we have, of course, but one of them is sometimes when you have a mushrooming effect, you start to see opportunities as competition. So whereas we could leverage our synergies and work together in the interest of the young person or the young people, the temptation that I've seen with youth chapters and organizations to compete, and yet the goal really is the same, to see the empowerment and representation and meaningful inclusion of young people in Uganda in policy formulation, to show the voice of the young people is meaningfully reflected in the shaping of our policy, development policy as a country. So I think for us as the board, the opportunity we have there is to see how we can enter into MOUs or even just partner and collaborate with those existing structures to see how we can deliver on our mandate. Yeah.
So the work again of the youth board, does that, for example, because one of the things they do is advise the policies and the programs, are the youths a part of the formulation of those national programs, or do they advise on the implementation, monitoring and evaluation? Like at what stage do the youths now become a part of this whole structure called the EU in Uganda?
Okay, so what happens with the EU? There is an overriding sort of policy, which is the multi-annual indicative program. And right now we are in the range from 2021 2027. So that particular document indicates the priority areas of the European Union, but also the target demographic groups. And it is in that document that you find youth as a focal group of particular interest to the EU, but also when you look at the different thematic areas or areas of particular interest to the EU, and some of them are into governance, like governance, the digital economy, the green economy, which is really and skilling and jobs as well, and even the issue of gender, many of which speak to the hearts of many young people. Personally, the green economy, which looks at energy and environment, the transition we've been talking about, essentially is how young people can meaningfully participate, because already as young people we have our own initiatives, going, and we'll talk about that subsequently. But also you find that the areas that interest us are again the avenues we have to contribute meaningfully. So the EU, for example, if the EU says that one of our focus areas is skilling and jobs, and then they have a series of programs that are targeting young people, and oftentimes they partner with existing structures. Sometimes even us, members of the board, we've been having the privilege of attending some of those events, but also because the EU partners with a number of other entities. Some have been with the National Youth Council, even UNSA, and even government within the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. And most of these events we've seen the State Minister for Children and Youth meaningfully participating, and we've had that interaction with them. So what the EU does, of course, the funds that are set aside for some of these programs, and so what they usually make an open call, young people apply. Sometimes the projects they fund and then they're able to have a trickle-down effect to the young people at the grassroots. So you find that the opportunities to participate are sort of spread across. And for us, because our role is largely advisory, is to come in and advise on, okay, this policy is what we think about it, this program is what we think about it, but also we think that if we are given the latitude to, say, partner or to collaborate with this particular youth structure, then we can be able to deliver on our mandate, and then that is also put into consideration. But also for the board as well, the opportunities we have to do capacity building, because many of the members of the board have their own organizations as well. So the idea is to have a trickle-down effect, that whereas we build capacity, as the board, the idea is to translate that in our different organizations, many of which are actually pro-youth and youth-led.
So then it even has lasting impact.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for that. I think for someone who's joining us from wherever you're watching us from today, you should be able to get a whole picture of what the YSB does. So it's like the representation it does of youths is so that you should actually get interested. Look out for these members of the youth body, including myself.
Certainly. I was about to mention that.
So you could look out for many of these young people. If you have particular areas of interest, the board has, like you mentioned, very many thematic areas, and those thematic areas have different leaders among those 20 people. So if you have an area that, for example, you're in gender, there's someone who's in gender. If it's human rights, there's someone in that area. So we can amplify the work the youths do, but also be able to contribute to the social development as we do with so much wish. So to move on, you want us to first move on from the YSB.
Sure.
You did mention in the beginning that your area of particular interest is in energy transition and its nexus, of course, with the climate and environment as a whole. First of all, as a country, and I'm asking you, well, as a youth, but largely as a citizen of Uganda or of the world, that's that. Where do we stand? Generally, where do we stand? And as a country, where are we right now in that space?
Okay, so the question of energy, Rogers, is very interesting. Because and it's a very timely conversation, and just trying to understand where I can pick it up from, because it is so broad. But let me begin from recent events, then giving a context to it. So last year at COP28 in Dubai, at the Ugandan Pavilion, we had the launch of the Energy Transition Plan, which is Uganda's ETP. And that plan was really a follow-up on our energy policy 2023, which was rolled out in April last year. And then we had a comprehensive review of that policy in September last year by International Energy Agency, which again, in light of the mandate of the International Energy Agency to sort of empower emerging and developing economies to come up with their own energy transition plans. Because truth be told, Rogers, there is no one size fits all when it comes to the energy transition. And I'm going to come back to why that statement is very important. Whereas there are global targets by 2030 and some by 2050 to hit net zero, you find that there are internal nuances, there are internal dynamics across states, across nations, that might require a domesticated, a localized approach, which I think in the Paris Agreement is dubbed the common but differentiated responsibilities. So you find that the goal is the same, to decarbonize, to transition, and that is a common goal. But the actual execution is subject to internal dynamics that must be borne in mind. So you find that how countries do that is through their energy transition plans, which of course should be in tandem with their nationally determined contributions in light of the Paris Agreement. And I feel like I've begun it from a high note, so I need to break down some of these things. So the idea is that, and I'm going to look at it twofold: climate and energy, because the whole conversation on energy transition really sprouts from the effect that our energy patterns or energy consumption patterns have had on our environment. So the data we have from the International Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, and of course backed by the studies that have been done and the reports over there by the International Energy Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and even other agencies like the World Bank and the IMF, and UNEP as well, different UN agencies, come to that conclusion of, for us to continue existing on this planet in livable circumstances or conditions, we must limit the global increase, the increase in global temperatures well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that is embedded in the Paris Agreement of 2015. But you find that what is contributing to climate change, of course, is the burning of fossil fuels. Of course, human activity is burning of fossil fuels, and that is coal, oil, and natural gas. And of course, why we are burning coal, oil, and natural gas is because of the question of energy. And so you find that energy contributes 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're going to remedy the problem, then we need to nip it in the bud. And so you find that energy plays a critical aspect in our response to climate change, both on mitigation, which is a reduction on greenhouse gas emissions, but also on adaptation, which looks at building capacity and resilience of communities to respond and withstand the adverse effects of climate change. So in that context, you find that whereas energy is an integral component of development, because for you to develop, you must industrialize.
That's true. Many of the developed countries came through industrialization.
Yes, exactly. And actually, you find that the Convention on Climate Change and Energy Transition looks at the pre-industrial stages, which was really before the industrialization of Europe. And much of Europe really, industrialized with a heavy reliance on coal. Heavy reliance on coal. And of course, subsequently on oil and gas. Yes, still do, and even revert. When now, because of the geopolitical tensions, across Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then we've seen scenarios where the UK and Germany and different countries in Europe have reverted to, relapsing, to commissioning new oil fields and coal fields, many of which had been decommissioned before. And we'll talk about that, those double standards and the effect they have on the energy transition. So what does it look like for Uganda now, statistically speaking? So the statistics we have from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics indicate that at present, about 94% of the population in Uganda depends on biomass, solid biomass for energy, and that is charcoal and firewood. Of course,
which have an impact, of course, on the environment.
On the environment, yes, exactly. So we're talking about energy consumption. So only about 6% of the population in Uganda has access to clean cooking technologies, right? Now, when it comes to what we call the hard-to-abate sectors, these are sectors that are very difficult, to alter and deploy renewable energy. And in Uganda, one of those has been transport, because we know that the cars we use here in Uganda are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, right? So whereas our national grid really is about 90% renewable because we use hydropower, that 10% of that is actually in the generation, because in the generation of that power, you find that we are using fossil fuels to run the generators. So in the generation, to run the turbines, in the generation, you find that we are still reliant on fossil fuels. So you find that even our grid is not 100% renewable because of the generation aspect. But hydropower is clean energy. But the generation aspect, is the process of generation. And so when you're looking at the carbon footprint of energy generation, you find that it sort of mars the whole process of energy generation. So you find that whereas we have 90% renewable energy on our national grid electricity, you find that the actual uptake of electricity in Uganda is about 8% in the rural areas. And yet 80% of the population in Uganda is in the rural areas. Can you imagine? Only 8% of Uganda's rural areas have access to electricity, right? And I think it's one of those facts really that has really informed the recent policy by the Ministry of Energy and Development to have the energy access a program, which is scaling program, to try and get about 1 million more connections on the national grid. But the thing is that why that is not viable, it's because in rural Uganda, many homesteads are actually sparsely, positioned.
Yeah.
So if you're going to intensify and expand the national grid, you're going to incur more expenses that do not make commercial sense. And so the solutions for some of those homesteads would actually be off the grid solutions.
Like using solar.
Using solar, and maybe using bioenergy that is sustainable, to see how you can sort of power those homesteads. So because of those dynamics, and for example, for the West Nile, for a long time, the West Nile was off the grid until I think there was a West
part
Nile.
Of it is
it's still off, yes, yeah. Until there was a whole project, I think a program on the West Nile electrification program of such, which now had to see how we can get off the grid solutions, or like mini grids for the West Nile. You see, so the dynamics are that we still have energy access challenges in Uganda. And yet the idea is to have universal energy access by 2030. And as you know, Rogers, in 2024, we have about 6 years. Actually, less than 6 years, yes, to get everyone, accessing power. So the challenges have been on accessing electricity, and then clean cooking, and also the hard to abate sector in Uganda sectors. One of them being transport. Yeah.
So I want to move to what's the role of the youth? But before I get to that, I wanted to. There was this interesting comment made by our Minister of Energy during the COP. Actually, I think she was at COP at the same time. She said that, in fact, I'm going to quote it as she said it. To tell us to stop fossil fuels is an insult. It's like you are telling Ugandans to stay in poverty. That's a mindset of a leader with whom we are trying to make sure that we move from fossil fuels to from those traditional ways of energy production and consumption to the renewable ones. How do you see us as a country, with where you've said where we stand right now? How do you see us as a country move to a better stand in that space? Or how do we make progress if we still have this back and forth with the leaders who are not believing the process itself?
So, I mean, you see, Rogers, that question is a global conversation. It's a global dilemma, Last year, I had the privilege of attending the Future of Energy conference in Ghana when I was doing some work at the Africa Center for Energy Policy. And on one of the panels, one of the conversations, really, about 5 panels, but one of them, the conversation was, what exactly does the energy transition mean for Africa, right? Because you've seen that many Western countries have been discouraging African countries from exploiting the oil, saying, no, you must abandon the oil and transition to clean energy. And when you look at the energy transition plan for Uganda, the plan is to use the money from the oil to transition. You see, really, that is the reasoning.
We must do more extractions
yes,
be able to transition.
To transition. Yeah, exactly. And when you look at the oil in the Albertine region, at least from the data we have about 6.5 billion barrels of oil, but about maybe 1.4 of those commercially viable, And so you find that, and of course now we have a whole pipeline that we're thinking about, not even thinking, now we've gone into, the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, ECOP, about 1,444 kilometers all the way till, the port in Tanzania. And we've talked about, having our own refinery here, So the challenge with that then is that some of these attitudes compromise the efforts we can put in the transition. Because Uganda finds herself at a crossroads of sorts. Yeah, should we go eco? Should we go renewable? And for me, my response to that has always been the same. That for us, renewable energy advocates across the globe, our mandate is very simple: to do the economics around the energy transition.
Yes.
Because
Understand the
yes, understand the economics of the energy transition.
Mm.
Because Rogers, I assure you, as long as the alternatives continue to remain more expensive as they are, we are going to have a challenge with renewable energy uptake and deployment. So the work we have on our hands at present is to ensure that the renewable stroke clean energy alternatives are cheaper and more cost effective than fossil fuels.
Mm.
The economics of the transition must make sense to the consumer.
To be able to
Yes.
take it serious.
Yes, that when you're given an option of fossil fuels and renewable energy, you go with renewable energy because it is more cost effective.
Mm.
Because truth be told, there are few consumers right now, and even in Uganda. Let me just talk about Uganda because the conversation must be localized.
Yes, it's true.
There are few consumers in Uganda, I tell you, Rogers, that care about the environmental aspects to energy.
Very few. That's very true. Very.
Very few. And it's part of the work that we've been doing on sensitization and awareness creation. But at present, there are very few that care about the environment or the effect that the energy consumption patterns have on the environment. That for someone to use electricity for cooking, it should make more sense than them using charcoal firewood.
Mm.
You see?
Mm.
So the challenge we have then is to ensure that electricity is accessible and affordable. More accessible, more affordable than firewood and charcoal. That's the conversation is going to zero down to that. The clean cooking technologies, the renewable energy alternatives must make more commercial sense to the consumer than fossil fuels. If we fail to achieve that, we're going to go in circles, which we have, and continue doing so until 2030 and 2050. Because as far as Uganda is concerned, in the ETP, the Energy Transition Plan, we shall hit net zero by 2065. You see? So the challenge we have, and that's why for me I decided, instead of confronting fossil fuel lobbyists and advocates, let me channel my energy to ensure that people understand why we must transition, why we must ensure that there is a more meaningful participation of the private sector through private sector investment and public-private partnerships to make the alternatives more available and more affordable to the ordinary consumer, the ordinary Ugandan, that they understand why we are transitioning and they can afford to be part of the transition. That is where the conversation should be. And as long as we fail to achieve that, we're going to keep going in circles.
That is true. I do agree with you.
Mm.
Now, again, I'm going to get back to that incident of our leader, our minister, and the statement she made, the one I mentioned earlier. What she said is just a representation of how the world is working.
True.
Even the West says one thing and does another. The double standard.
Double standards, yes. Yeah.
Do you think as a world, because also the achievement of this whole process, even for Uganda itself, is not about the work Uganda alone can see.
Of course.
It's just more than that. It's about how collectively we're moving towards the green energy. So with the double standards that are happening, what do you think we could, what tools are there, are left at our disposal to be able to move this process?
Okay, so I think for me, what makes more sense is understanding the localized aspect of the transition. And that's why I talked about the energy transition plan. That whereas we have this plan with support from the International Energy Agency, you find that the advantages that accrue to the transition as a result of our participation, or rather the other way around, that accrue as a result of our meaningful participation in the transition, right? So, whereas the global double standards, and we've seen this, where countries decommission coal fields and oil, and then where they are, hard pressed, they get right back, because the question of energy security is very important. It can threaten the livelihoods of people, and in extension, governments. So I think for me, the approach to that should be fundamentally to understand why we are transitioning. When you understand the why, it doesn't matter who is saying what, who is doing what, you know the purpose why you're transitioning, right? And so you find that in Uganda, one of the reasons why we want to transition is because the transition sort of gives us a diversified energy mix. That now we have more energy sources in our mix that are more available, more affordable. But also, when there's so many options, then the cost is bound to go down because you have alternatives and there are more players along in the sector or in the market. And so you find that, of course, even the quality is going to improve because of competition. But at the end of the day, the final beneficiary is really the consumer, the ordinary Ugandan, the last person, yes. So for me, I think that, because you see, the thing about global dynamics is that everyone looks out for themselves. If something threatens their, livelihood, or threatens, their mandate as a government, they're bound to find something that is going to work for them in that time. You see? And so I don't think we should be discouraged by the double standards we see across the globe, because even those countries have put in place initiatives that sort of, do enhance the uptake or deployment of renewable energy. So for us to be focused, we must understand why. Why are we transitioning? Why are we venturing into investment in renewable energy, in green energy? And once we understand that it is for our own good, then we embark on it without consideration of who has said what, who has done what, because we know what it means for us and for our economy.
Right.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And then now, my one of the last questions in that issue. We are here as youths, and as much as all of these things affect all of us as a community, there's a contribution each of the constituents of those people has to go into this whole process. So from the youth perspective, what do you see as the role of young people in this whole energy transition, and locally, but also you could take it internationally, either one, some constituents of youth. What do we do? What is our role?
So for me, Rogers, on that, I came to the appreciation of the young people at the time when I was doing some work with the International Renewable Energy Agency. At the time when we had the youth forum, the Arena Youth Forum last year, and we were sort of trying to work on an action for climate toolkit, which empowers young people to participate meaningfully in the energy transition. It was really a project initiative by IRENA, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I think UNICEF, but also the SDG 7 Youth Constituents of the UN, Major Group on Children and Youth. And so we understand that the energy transition, it requires all hands on deck. And one of the really fresh perspectives that young people bring is to do with the innovation and creativity that the transition requires. We have young people that are professionals, for example, could be engineers, could be advocates, it could be, in content creation or in graphics designing, in whatever. So the idea was that the young people understand that they're an integral component of the transition, because the idea is to have a future that we can enjoy as young people. Yes, as a whole. So we must be meaningfully involved in shaping, what that future would look like. So one of the myths around the participation of young people was that young people are not equipped. They're not.
They don't have much of the
knowledge, and technical know-how to, participate meaningfully. But we saw that there are so many avenues to participate. For the young people that are professionals, engineers, also they can go ahead and get their heads around these clean cooking technologies or renewable energy technologies, but also for activists, to go ahead and create more awareness and advocate for the deployment of renewable energy, for content creators to create content around the transition, but also for peer-to-peer engagement, that we're able to educate, to bring on board many more young people within our circles to understand the transition, but also to hold our leaders accountable. For example, when a minister makes a statement like that, and we are holding them accountable, we are reminding them that our commitment in our NDC is to reduce emissions by 2030 from 22% to 24.7%. So in holding our leaders accountable and trying to bring them to align with our commitments as a country and on the transition, we are participating meaningfully. But also to undertake projects or initiatives through our own organizations or organizations we can work with that are like-minded to see how we can participate meaningfully in the transition. Of course, looking at the other aspect of climate, which looks at adaptation and mitigation. So there are so many avenues that as young people we can participate. But also in running for office, to be, for these positions that enable us to be policymakers, as young people, we can also aspire to influence from within, yes. Whereas it's good to influence from without, it's also possible for us to, get into some of these institutions and structures and influence from within. So as young people, we just need to be deliberate and believe that we can do this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I also do understand that you attended COP today. Is that right? You did. Just a sneak peek on what was maybe the main focus for this one particular year. I want to believe there's a particular interest every single year that the focus is for the COP. So what was it for this year, and what were the main resolutions that we need to be looking out for?
So after COP, or actually during the negotiations at COP28 in Dubai, in the UAE, usually when it comes to the conclusion of some of these summits, there's what we call the outcome document. For example, a few months before that, we were in Nairobi for the Africa Climate Summit and the Africa Climate Week, and after that, we had the Nairobi Declaration, which was the outcome document of the summit. And the theme of the summit then was driving green growth and climate finance solutions for Africa and the world. So the focus was really on climate finance for the summit. But for COP28, the focus, of course, was on climate finance, like very important, but also on the energy transition. And to begin with the energy transition, which we've been talking about, the resolutions in the UAE consensus were about threefold. There were more, but the primary, the very critical ones were about three on the energy transition. The first was to do with a tripling of renewable energy deployment. That we need by 2030, the goal really right now is to triple renewable energy deployment. And then secondly, to double energy efficiency. And then third is, of course, to do with financing of the transition. Because, taking us back to the convention we had at the summit, that Africa was only attracting about 13% of the global, climate finance. And yet you find that Africa is at the forefront of the climate crisis. And yet Africa only contributes about 3.8% to global greenhouse gas emissions. You see? So the injustice there is that you contribute the least and are the most affected.
Yes.
You see? And so that's why one of the resolutions, again, groundbreaking resolutions really was the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP28. And we had talked about this all the way from Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt.
I think the Loss and Damage Fund began from 27.
Yes, not even 27. It began about 2-3 COPs ago, because even in Glasgow in 2021, it was a conversation that had been gaining momentum, and then there was a committee that was set aside, and to venture into now understanding how the fund would work in Sharm el Sheikh, and then eventually it was operationalized in Dubai. Yes. And there's a whole document on that. Now the challenge is that at the time we were done, I think with COP, we had about $100 million also commitments.
I saw there were some commitments.
Yes. Whereas the fund is looking at $100 billion annually, $100 billion US. Yes, $100 billion US annually for the Loss and Damage Fund. You find that it doesn't make sense, right?
It does not.
The aspirations are $100 billion, but the commitments made, and of which, by the way, the irony is that the commitments do not translate into fulfillment of the same.
They make commitments.
Yes, exactly, but fulfilling, yes. Because we also had so many commitments at the Africa Climate Summit
in
Nairobi. But fulfilling is where the challenge is. Fulfilling is where the challenge is. So you find that The commitments are many, but the fulfillment is not in tandem with the with the commitments as we have them. So, and yet the challenge then is that what we need in Africa is adaptation.
Yes.
Most importantly, how do we cope with the adverse effects of climate change? But also because the energy transition has such a huge financial implication in our economies. And so, how do we access finance? And it's one of the aspirations in the energy transition plan that we have. How do we access finance on favorable terms? Because we also need to be very careful, Rogers, not to worsen our debt situation by borrowing to finance the transition.
Yes.
Right? So,
which is a practice we have had for
yes,
a while
for a while. You see? So you solve one problem by creating another.
Problem, yes.
And then you know now you're in that vicious cycle of problems. You see? But because the transition has a financial implication, then we need to have both, of course, at the international level, but also locally, mechanisms how we can access concessional financing or even outright grants that are geared towards facilitating the energy transition. So I think for me that if we look at it that way, we have to do the economics of the transition. At the end of the day, we must have an understanding. It does make commercial sense. And as long as it still eludes us on that front alone, we unfortunately might not be able to achieve the targets that we've set to achieve with universal energy access by 2030, but also on the transition from fossil fuels to cleaner, affordable, and sustainable green energy as we have it.
Thank you so much. That's I have one major takeaway, especially in the conversation about the energy transition is the localization.
Yes.
If I don't understand the impact locally, I want to be able to contribute to a global effort.
True.
So if it makes sense to me, it makes sense to everyone in their local villages, for example. Then it makes sense to everyone at that side. So thank you so much for making that. Also, I wanted to move to, lastly, about what you do as an individual. I understand, and you did mention on the beginning that most of the youths who are members of the Youth Standing Board do have their local initiatives in form of organizations, in form of businesses, and all of this. So what is it that you do? And what exactly? First, what do you do? And then we'll move into how is it, what change you seek, for example, to make, and how are you using that space?
Okay, so like I said, professionally, I'm a lawyer, but vocationally, I am an energy and climate justice advocate. And at present, I have the privilege of leading the team at the Climate Action Leadership Incubator, where the idea really behind the incubator is to break down the often intricate language employed in climate action and the energy transition into language that can easily be understood by young people in Uganda. And maybe something I should have mentioned in the beginning is that usually when we say young people and we say 78%, we do not disaggregate that particular bit of our statistics as we have them. But to just go slightly deeper into the 78%, let me go with the 77%, which is really the more appreciated bit of the statistics. You find that about 50% of that 77, yes, is actually when you look at 77 as it is, the 50% of that 77, it's actually children.
Yeah, children.
The youth, us who are always making the noise as we are 77%, but like 22%, we're just 22% of that 77. You see? So you find that the focus is given to youth, but the children have not been meaningfully involved in this conversation. And so you find that at the Climate Action Leadership Incubator, we look at the whole chain of how do we engage children
right from
primary schools, all the way till tertiary and even to university. So we look at the whole chain, as we have look at the whole demographic group, the 77% as we have it, and we do that through music, dance, and drama and poetry, and we had our launch just last year should have been in October. And so right now we've been trying to reach out to schools, and we have a partnership with UNSA, and to reach out to schools and to sort of come up with documents as well that break down this language that is embedded in all these conventions and agreements into language that young people can understand, easily appreciate and can relate with. And the idea behind that really is to, first of all, get them to understand the problem as we have it and the convention as we have it right now on climate action and the energy transition, but most importantly, to inspire the action that can be led by children and youth in response to the problem as we have it at present. So fundamentally, we do green education. Yeah, that's what really we do at the Climate Action Leadership Incubator. And the idea is to scale that and to see how we can venture into leveraging that green education to sort of champion children and youth-led action.
Oh, wow. You did mention that you are a lawyer by profession, but an energy advocate by vocation. So more like a good part of your life is in the vocation.
That's true. I'm as guilty as you judged me.
but as we come to a conclusion.
Yes, Roger.
This space is for mostly young people and youth, and how we contribute to the social and collective development in community.
Yeah.
A lot of people who termed themselves revolutionaries always looked at what the contribution of youth, usually the growth of a community, is also comes from the effort of its youth.
Yeah, true.
What is it that they do?
Yeah.
So as we do conclude this edition today, we'll certainly come again another time and then try to see how we are faring and in many of these spaces. How would you advise the young person who is on the other side of the screen to just be participating in whatever they are doing? It may not necessarily be in the energy transition. It could be in a totally different thing, but it contributes to the social development generally. How would you conclude by encouraging them to participate?
All right. So really the parting shot for me to the young person out there is that the future of our country is right in our hands. It's going to be us to bear the sharpest brunt of whatever is going on in our country that we choose to sort of ignore or take the backseat. So in whatever we are doing, in whatever sphere that we are contributing to national development or to the betterment of our country, to see Uganda in a better place, or to have Uganda again see a better future, my encouragement to you is do not give up. Because sometimes the situation at hand is very pessimistic. It looks like it's just not what you're expecting to see. But there was one of the famous philosophers who said that that there's nothing that ever changed the world, but a group of few people that were determined to see the revolution they wanted to see. So it might not even be political revolution, or it might be small steps that we're taking to, better our communities, to reach out to vulnerable people in our communities, to see our communities better. The idea is do not give up. Those baby steps eventually will pay off. And so as young people, of course, we talk about this with the majority, and sometimes you can be the majority, but with, powers as if you're in the minority, So the idea is to never give up, to be steadfast, to continue with those baby steps, continue with the initiatives that we have as young people in the hope of a better tomorrow, but also to work with, like-minded young people, because together we can get Uganda to a better place.
All right. Thank you so much. I have a friend who likes to say I have absolutely nothing useful. But you did talk about pessimism. Yesterday I was in a space that had a lot of young people, and they were talking about the performance of our leaders generally, specifically National Assembly. One lady stood up and said, all of those people are useless. They're saying all of what we are doing is just a waste of time. There's nothing we're going to change. There was such a negative energy about the work that people are doing, instead of optimism that as we are here, we're going to contribute to this process, make it better. We seem to resign even more. So as I also conclude again, I want to feed into what you said, that it's going to take all of us collectively.
True.
But it's also going to take a commitment. It's going to take positivity, believing in what we are doing.
True.
We can't expect growth or progress where we are putting efforts that we already feel like they won't yield any results. It doesn't make any sense. So folks, just focus on what you're doing, like you said. Don't give up on it, but also be positive about it and talk about it. Whatever space you get, please talk about all of these things. So thank you so much for the time and for all of these things. I've learned a lot in just the shortest time we've been here. I'll probably be reaching out to learn a few, 2 or 3 things about your vocation, and together we'll make this community a better place. My name again is Roger Suyagwa, and with me was Howard Mwesigwa, the chairperson of the EU Youth Sounding Board here in Uganda, and many other titles I'm not going to get into. But I do appreciate you. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Please put your comments again in those comment sections. We will revisit them. It will inform some of the discussions moving forward. It's just a beginning, and we're gonna move together. Thank you so much.